This is the sketch of a conference that I'm doing in Sao Paulo on a colloquium about the thought of French thinker Rene Girard. The title of my presentation is Girard for the Non-Religious. My name is Gabriel Andrade and I'm a professor at La Universidad del Zulia in Maracaibo, Venezuela. Now, most of the people that are here at this conference are religious believers. For instance, James Allison, one of the organizers, is an ordained priest, and another important speaker in this conference was Robert Hamilton Kelly. He is also a pastor. And I once went to a conference from the Colloquium on Violence and Religion back in the year 2002 at the University of Purdue. And I had a wonderful time there. I met some wonderful people there. I had some great discussions about the thought of Rene Girard, and I was given a wonderful treatment. But I couldn't say that I felt totally integrated. And part of the reason for which I didn't feel totally integrated with the people of the Colloquium on Violence and Religion, it was because I came to discover that they held some religious belief that I just could not accept. So that kept me wondering, well, what can a person with some secular beliefs, such as myself, what can a non-Christian and even a non-religious person do about Girard? And that's what I'm going to try to do in this conference. I'm going to see what a non-religious person can do with the thought of Rene Girard. Now, before I begin, I want to make clear what my tentative religious beliefs are. And I say that they're tentative because, well, I'm only 30 years old, and these are positions over which I really have no definite stand yet, and perhaps in the future I might change them. But for the time being, first of all, I think that nothing must be accepted on the basis of faith. And I think that entails evidentialism and rationalism. I think if you're going to believe something, well, you have to see some evidence for it. And in this sense, I'm sympathetic to the late Carl Sagan's famous phrase that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And also to Thomas the Apostle. Of course, the story about Thomas the Apostle, I consider it to be a myth, but I'm sympathetic to the character. In order to see something, to believe something, well, you have to see some evidence that supports that belief. So in that sense, I don't have faith in the existence of God. If I'm going to believe that God exists, well, I want to see some evidence that He exists, or at least I want to consider some rational arguments in favor of His existence. Now, there have been some rational arguments for the existence of God, for instance, those of Thomas Aquinas, and I think those arguments are interesting and considerable, but I don't think they work. I think they have various logical flaws, so I reject them. But not only that, but I also see that the problem of evil has no solution. If God is good and omnipotent, why is there evil in the world? The various answers that have been given to this question, I don't think they work. I think they all have logical flaws. So, not only do I not see evidence in favor of the existence of God, I also see evidence against the existence of God. Now, I wouldn't call myself an atheist because I'm still open to the idea that God might exist. But before I believe in God, I want to see some evidence that He exists. I mean, perhaps in the future I might change my mind. If God appears in the clouds and He says, "Here I am, I exist," in that case I'll change my mind. But first, I want to see some evidence. Not only that, I also think that only material things exist. And I think that spiritual things are merely emergent phenomena. And in such a manner, I don't think souls exist. And this is very far removed from Christian dualism. Traditional Christian dualism believes that human beings are made up of two substances, souls and body. I, on the other hand, I am a materialist, so I think that we're only made up of bodies, and I don't think souls and other spiritual things, such as angels or even God, exist. I also think that miracles do not occur, and I think David Hume offers some very good reasons not to believe in miracles. I also think that we are determined, but perhaps we do have free will, and this is the position known as compatibilism in philosophy. And I believe that there is no afterlife. Although I'd like to be immortal, that would be a nice thing, to live on forever. But I think that science, much more than religion, is in a better position to offer us immortality. Now, can someone with these beliefs be a Girardian? Well, My answer is that only partially. And here I propose to do with Girard something similar to what Thomas Jefferson did with the Bible. As you know, Thomas Jefferson, one of the founding fathers of America, he took some scissors and he cut out those passages from the Bible which he thought would not be believable by a rational person. Namely, those passages that appeal to supernatural revelation and narrates some miracles. So he basically kept the ethical message and the historical narratives that have nothing to do with supernatural appeals or with miracles. Well, I propose to do the same with Girard. I propose to grab some scissors, metaphorically speaking, and cut out those passages that I think a secular person could not accept. And in that sense, well, I accept the secular stuff, but I propose to do away with the apologetic or the supernatural part. Now let's see how may I do this. And in order to see what can be kept from Girard, well, let's consider first what his main thought is all about, his main work. And you're probably all familiar with this, but let's go over this very quickly. There are three basic points in Girard's mimetic theory. The first thesis is that desire is mimetic and this leads to violence. If we imitate each other, well, we wind up imitating each other's desires, and this can easily lead us to a rivalry where if we desire the same things, well, we'll wind up being rivals and eventually there will be conflict. The second point of Girard's thought system is that, well, when there is rivalry in a community and there is inner violence, the scapegoat mechanism works as a way to secure peace in a given community. And this scapegoat mechanism becomes the foundation of culture. And Girard says that, well, that original sin where a community projects violence upon a scapegoat is the foundation of all cultural life, and especially the institutions of ritual, myth, and prohibitions are ultimately related to the scapegoat mechanism. But there is also a third thesis that Girard considers, and that is that the Bible is singular in its defense of victims and uncovers the scapegoat mechanism. Girard says that myths tell the story of scapegoating from the perspective of scapegoaters, whereas the Bible tells the story of scapegoating from the perspective of the victim. Now, once you tell the story from the perspective of the victim, you realize that the victim is not guilty. And by realizing that the victim is not guilty and that the victim is indeed a scapegoat, then the scapegoating mechanism no longer works. And this is why Girard says that there's no such thing as conscious scapegoating. So the Bible, by telling the story from the perspective of the victims, uncovers the scapegoat mechanism and allows it not to work any longer. But there is also a fourth thesis not fully developed in Girard's work, but he every once in a while mentions it. And that's the idea that the Bible is divinely inspired. Now, this is not, as my friend Joao Cesar de Castro Rocha seems to believe, and we've talked a number of times about this, this is not merely a personal opinion or a religious preference from Girard. I think that Girard seems to believe that if his first three premises are correct, that is to say, mimetic desire, the scapegoat mechanism, and the Bible's singularity in telling the story of scapegoating from the perspective of the victims, if those three theses are correct, then the Bible is divinely inspired, Christianity is a revealed religion, and of course God exists. So in a sense, very much as Aquinas and other apologists, Girard is trying to rationally prove the existence of God and the divine origin of the Bible and Christianity. And in case you have some doubts that this is what Girard thinks, well, here are a couple of passages from his work suggesting that view. For instance, in Things Hidden Since the Foundation of the World, he says, "The authentic knowledge about violence and all its works to be found in the Gospels cannot be the result of human action alone." And by this, he means that God must have intervened in order to write the Gospels. Human beings could not have done it by themselves. Another passage expressing the similar idea can be found in I See Satan Fall Like Lightning, where he says, and I quote, "Until now, I have always been able to find plausible responses to questions posed in this book, within a purely commonsensical and anthropological context, that is to say, a secular explanation. This time, however, it is impossible. To break the power of mimetic unanimity, we must postulate a power superior to violent contagion, and of course, that power is God, and he even says it himself there. If we have learned one thing in this study, it is that none exists here on the earth. So that power comes from heaven, and it is divine. Now, a key question here is, following Girard's argument, it leads to this conclusion: how can someone with my beliefs resist Girard's apologetic? And indeed, how may I resist Girard's apologetic? Well, I think that as with any argument whose conclusion one does not accept, one basically has two options. In rejecting an argument, you can either reject the veracity of the premises, or you can reject the logical soundness or the validity of the argument, even if you were to accept the veracity of the premises. Or you can challenge both. So, the secular thinker has basically three options in the face of Girard's apologetic argument. First of all, I can challenge the veracity of the premises, and in that case I can challenge the veracity of mimetic desire, of the scapegoat mechanism, and the singularity of the Bible. Or I can challenge the soundness or the logical validity of the conclusion, and in this case Girard's conclusion is that the Bible is divinely inspired. Or I can challenge both. And that's what I'll do. I'll try to challenge both the veracity and the logical validity of Girard's argument. Now here is my challenge to Girard's first two theses. Regarding mimetic desire, I don't have much of a challenge there. I think neuroscience confirms ever more the reality of mimetic desire, and the work in mirror neurons is going towards that direction. Although I do wish to warn that the work in mirror neurons and neuroscience in general seems to propose a materialist conception of the mind that is very far removed from traditional Christian dualism. And the foremost neuroscientist that is working today with mirror neurons, the Indian scholar Ramachandran, he is a materialist, and I think he has little patience for Christian dualism and the ideas of souls and spirit and the like. Regarding the scapegoat mechanism, there I have a partial challenge. No doubt scapegoating occurs, and you can see it everywhere. You can see it in the news, you can see it in Greek tragedy, you can see it in Shakespeare, you can see it in sports, in soap operas, etc. But I am not sure that it can be accounted as the foundation of culture. I do not think that all myths, rituals, and taboos are about scapegoating violence. And it seems to me that sometimes Girard seems to exaggerate the power of explanation of his mimetic theory. For instance, Girard considers that hunting and the domestication of animals were a way to reenact sacrifice. Now this is very different from what most archaeologists and paleontologists and historians tell us. Hunting and the domestication of animals were done for other reasons. So I'm not sure that you can say that every aspect of culture is ultimately referred to the scapegoat mechanism. And indeed, scapegoating occurs, but I just won't find it acceptable to say that human beings became human beings because of the scapegoat mechanism, and that it is the foundation of all culture. I think it has some relevance, but I'm not sure that it can be accepted, as Girard says it is, as the foundation of cultural life. Now, regarding Girard's third thesis, and that is the Bible's singularity, I have more of a challenge there. I think that Girard tends to exaggerate the contrast between the Bible and myths. I think Girard is not really fair in the application of standards. Whenever he sees a myth, he immediately goes to see there is violence, even if that violence is not really expressed. And whenever he reads a story in the Bible, he immediately goes and says, this is not really about violence, but this is really about the uncovering of violence. But I don't think he's really fair in his application of his standards. I think that when studying myths, sometimes Girard claims to see violence where there really isn't. For instance, there is a South African myth about a snake going to live in the bottom of the sea. And Girard considers that immediately that is death by drowning. But Perhaps not. Perhaps it's just a story about a snake going to live in the bottom of the sea, and it is concerned, for instance, with submarine life or some other thing. So, I think Girard sometimes has the tendency to be preconceived the idea that the myths are about mystified violence and the Bible does the reverse. And I think that is not that clear. Indeed, I think he tends to overlook mystified violence in the New Testament. Now, I know this is a topic open to debate, but I think that Jesus' apocalyptic teaching, and of course the book of Revelation, is not merely a warning about future human violence. It is also an announcement of imminent divine punishment. And as I said, this is a topic open to debate, but there have been plenty of very competent scholars of the historical Jesus and the New Testament, for instance, Albert Schweitzer, but more recently Hector Avalos or Bart Ehrman. These historians have told us that Jesus was an apocalyptic preacher, but he didn't preach a warning against future human violence. No, he actually said, well, God is going to intervene and punish the sinful and send terrible battles to earth, and he's going to send catastrophes and so on. So this is a way to mystify violence, and I think Girard is overlooking what happens really in the New Testament. Also, against Girard, I think there is some seed of anti-Semitism in the Gospel. Girard has an essay where he says that the Gospels are not anti-Semitic, but I disagree. The Gospels were written after the year 70, after the destruction of the Temple and the Jewish-Roman wars. And the first Christian community, well, they wanted to be in good terms with the Romans, who were the victors in that war. And one way to be in good terms with the Romans was by exonerating Roman guilt in the arrest and execution of Jesus, and by exaggerating Jewish guilt in the arrest and execution of Jesus. And in that sense, well, the Gospels become a little bit like persecution text. And I think Girard overlooks this, but he should pay more attention to this. And also, in the New Testament, well, a lot of scholars have said that there is a tacit approval of slavery. And if the Gospels really had nothing to do with mystified violence, well, they would have said something against the institution of slavery. But the fact that they don't, well, that makes them complicit in the mystifying of violence and saying, well, that slaves just have to obey and accept the treatment given by their masters. Now, apart from that, I am willing to make a concession, and that is that on the whole, I admit that Christianity is indeed singular in its defense of victims. A non-Christian such as Nietzsche clearly saw this. But my point, I insist, is that Christianity may not be as singular as Girard thinks it is. Now, even if the Bible were singular, so I'm now proceeding to my second strategy. I'm going to accept for the time being the veracity of the premises, but now I want to challenge the logical validity of Girard's argument. Even if the Bible were singular, I think that the fact that something is singular does not make its origin divine. The Bible may be singular in many aspects, and many apologists have mentioned some of these aspects. For instance, the overcoming of persecution, or the alleged scientific knowledge that's in the Bible, or the Bible's self-reference about being divine. It is supposedly the only book that says that itself is written by God. Or even the popularity of the Bible. All of that may be true, but I don't think that it proves divine origin. The fact that the Bible is the book that has been read the most throughout history doesn't prove that it was written by God. I think it only proves that it's the most popular book ever. And I think that one may look for natural explanations for the Bible and Christianity's singularity in its defense of victims. And for instance, we may consider Max Weber's explanations. Max Weber frequently said, especially in his work Ancient Judaism, that the tendency of Jews and Christians to write their stories from the perspective of the victims may be explained by taking in consideration the fact that both Jews and Christians were persecuted by big empires. First, the Jews by, the Egyptians, and then the Babylonians, and then the Persians, and then the Greeks, and then the Christians by both Jews and the Romans. So in that sense, the fact that they were persecuted and they were minority groups, that allowed them to write text from the perspective of the victim. Now, this may not be a very good explanation, and perhaps I agree with Girard that Max Weber's explanation is not a good one. But this is the kind of explanation that we should look for. We should look for secular explanations. And even if we accepted that the Bible were indeed singular, well, perhaps we need to work a little bit harder historically to understand what were the historical conditions that allowed the text to be that way. Because in this sense, I think Girard may be falling into a God of the gaps trap. Now, the God of the gaps is a concept that has been recently in the press due to controversies in the intelligent design movement and evolution. Whenever some scientists cannot explain the origin of some given thing in nature, for instance, DNA, or how DNA came to exist, or how the first cell, the first form of life arose, well, there is a tendency among religious believers to say, well, if science can't explain it, then God did it. But this is what's known as a God of the gaps. I mean, that God that's being invoked is there just to fill gaps in our knowledge of nature. And against this God of the gaps concept, one may argue that the fact that I cannot explain something does not imply that God did it. And the God of the gaps argument really appeals to ignorance. So it's an argument that appeals to ignorance, an argument ad ignorantiam. And it's a very weak argument. I mean, before, men could not explain thunders, so they attribute it to God. But once men discover what were the causes of thunders, well, then God lost space there. And I think this God of the gaps mentality, well, it's a little bit of intellectual laziness. I mean, the fact that we cannot understand something, or the fact that we haven't found the explanation for something, does not imply that it is divine. And I think we should do the same with Girard's thesis about the Bible's singularity. I mean, we should look harder. We can agree that perhaps for the time being, there is no rational secular explanation for why the Bible is singular. But the fact that the Bible is singular and that for the time being we don't have a fully developed natural explanation of that phenomenon, that doesn't imply that God did it. Because if we just say that because we don't understand the Bible's singularity, the origins of the Bible's singularity, well, then it must be attributed to God, that is falling into a God of the gaps trap. So, in conclusion, I think that Girard's work is valuable to me as much as the Bible was valuable to Thomas Jefferson. Girard's psychology, his anthropology, and his literary studies are extremely relevant. But his theology, or for that matter, any theology, is not appealing to somebody with my secular metaphysical beliefs. So I think Girard can be rescued from Christian apologetics. I think a secular person such as myself has a lot to do with Girard's interesting insights, but I don't think his apologetic should be accepted by anybody, or not, at least not by me. Well, thank you very much, and this is a picture of Brazil against my home country, Venezuela. Thank you very much.